Jessica, thanks so much for joining me today on the Minimalist Moms podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you. We're going to be talking about creating peaceful bedtimes with your toddler today. So I can't wait to pick your brain. I'm a little bit out of the season, but it'll just be nice to hear your tips for the listeners that are going through the season of their own. But before we get there, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and then we'll start.
Yeah, so I'm Jessica Berk. I am the founder of Awesome Little Sleepers, and I specialize in helping families with kids of toddlers and preschoolers get their kids to sleep. So if you think about sleep consultants, you might be thinking about babies, but we all know if we've had kids that have grown up and gone out of the crib, we know that once kids are sleeping in an open bed, the sleep struggles are way different than when you had a baby, right? Because now you've got a walking, talking, strong-willed little personality. So that is what I help parents. That's what I help parents solve: get their kids to go to bed peacefully in the evenings and sleep all the way through the night.
Okay. I think for some, this seems impossible.
Good.
It's my kid's never going to listen. I've already created bad habits. I don't know how to break them. So, again, I'm glad that you're here today to share your expertise in this area. I'm curious to know, what are some of the common challenges that you hear parents say they face when trying to establish not just a bedtime routine, but the peaceful bedtime routine?
Well, I think what happens a lot of times, and I'm speaking from my own experience as a mom of two little girls. Well, not so little anymore, but what happens is we establish, a bedtime routine because we hear that bedtime routines are important. And so, when our kid starts to, maybe they're like 18 months old, you start to think, okay, let's sit and we'll kind of look at a book together, and you kind of establish a little bit of a bedtime routine. And then you try to stick with it. But as your kid gets older, all of a sudden they are, pushing boundaries, asking for another book, another page of a book. Oh, now they're hungry. Oh, now they're thirsty. And so as a parent, you're just kind of like, tackling these requests, in a one-off fashion. But what happens then is it's kind of like giving your kid an invitation to like keep asking for more and more things. So the reason the evenings get to be like not peaceful is because of all the stalling that our kids can do, right? And then either the kid getting frustrated if they're not getting what they want, they're also getting tired because they're going to bed too late, too late, too late because they keep stalling. But also, we as the moms are getting frustrated too because we don't know how to make it stop. And so we're just kind of desperately thinking, okay, I'll just read one more page. Okay, I'll just do one more page, or I'll just do one more thing. Maybe this is the last thing. And then lots of times we end up, getting frustrated, losing our cool. And this is just not a good way to end the day with our kids. No one feels good about that.
Yes, absolutely. I think that time right before bedtime, I was talking about it with author Maggie Smith. We were talking about changing our mindset there at bedtime because so often it's the negative thoughts that are the loudest as we have time to like sit and just be alone with our thoughts. So we were talking about switching those thoughts to the positive ones and really focusing on gratitude at that time of day. But I think even with our little kids, it's that time where everyone's trying to relax and wind down. And yes, peaceful is the word that I'm looking for, that I would just want to make sure that that time is for everyone involved. So what are some strategies that you have to make it more of a peaceful time and not so either chaotic with their behavior or with us just being at the end of our ropes at the end of the day?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what's like kind of at the heart of what gets everybody the most frustrated. Like, I think the reason why we as parents end up losing our cool is because things aren't going the way that we expect them to go. We are trying desperately to do things that, our child isn't listening to. It's not working. We start to feel out of control and we get nervous because we don't know how to get things back on track. But the truth is, that's exactly how our kids feel when we are kind of allowing them to get away with all of this stalling. What happens is our kids start to think like, okay, well, I'm going to keep asking for things. I'm going to keep doing these things. And then your kid also starts to feel like a little bit out of control. Like, who's in charge around here? We have these, mirror neurons where we are interacting with our kids, and our stress and frustration is we're reflecting them back on each other. And so we're getting everybody all worked up. So the best thing to do to relieve that is really have a bedtime routine that is truly routine. So when we talk about routines, we mean your bedtime routine should have clearly defined steps. It should be the same steps every night, no matter who puts the kid to bed. And it doesn't need to be extensive. It doesn't need to be some hour-long thing unless you want it to be. It could be a quick 15, 20-minute time for connection with your child that is well-defined. And
Mm.
those steps can look different for every family. I mean, we all have a few things that we probably do for our kids' bedtime, like brush your teeth, put on your PJs. Aside from that, if you want to read books, if you want to sing songs, if you want to say prayers, if you want to have talk time, it's
Mhm.
all customizable to like whatever is going on in your family, but it needs to be well structured.
Mhm.
And what helps to bring peace to that process is actually bringing your older, more mature kid, like once they're over 3 years old, you can do this process with them where you actually give them some control about what's happening at bedtime. So
Mhm.
you work with them to establish that routine. And you're not doing this at night in the middle of the bedtime routine. You're doing this at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon,
Mhm.
and you're going to create a routine that's going to stick with you for months and months until you decide to revise it. And
Yeah.
your kid has input into that. So input could be anything that you want it to be. It could be do you want to brush your teeth before you put on your PJs or after? So they could help order some of the things.
Mhm.
Or you could say, do you want to read one book or two books? Give them a choice like that. So
Mhm.
really bringing your kid in because collaboration invites cooperation.
Mhm.
So if you really bring your kid into the process and help them build some structure, it goes a long way to getting them to actually go along with it.
Mhm.
And we know that once you start a habit where you're in this routine, it's much easier to stick to it. And it can start to signal to your kid that at the end of the day, these are the things that we do for bedtime. It can actually start to help release melatonin and, bring your kid into more of a restful, peaceful state to go to bed.
I'm so glad you said back at the beginning of your answer, you said that it could be as long as you want it to be. For me, it's always been a shorter routine, maybe 15 minutes with the brushing teeth, PJs, book, which now I think it's kind of fun. We moved back in October, and I used to do the book in the bedroom, in their bedrooms or on the couch, but now it's kind of fun because I let them come into my bed just for that time because we've never been people that really let our kids in our bed, maybe the random occurrence, but it just feels like the special part of our routine. But all that to say, mine's 15 minutes. My sister says hers ends up being an hour. And I always wondered, are your kids not wanting to go to bed because it is this long routine? So I'm glad that you said it kind of just depends on the family. Because I guess my question that I have within that is, does a certain time maybe prolong the kids wanting to go to bed? Too short, they still want mom and dad. Too long, then they're like, oh, they can just stay here for however long.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's best to try to back into it based on when you want like lights out to be. So
Okay.
if you have kids under 6 years old, I recommend that your goal is to have your kids asleep by 8. So that
Okay.
means you would have lights out by let's say around 7:45 because it takes kids 15 to 20 minutes to fall asleep usually.
Mhm.
So if you want to back into it that way. So if you want to have a long drawn out bedtime routine, then just start it at 6:45. You don't want to start a long bedtime routine at 8 because then you're going to be your kid's going to be going to bed way too late. And then what happens if you start the bedtime routine too late
Mhm.
is your kid can kind of reach that point of getting overtired where they kind of have a spike of cortisol and they almost get like a second wind. And for
Mhm.
most kids, that happens like I'd say around 8:15 or so. And if they're not in bed, kind of asleep by then, they almost get the second wind. And then it's really tough for them to fall asleep until like 9:30 time frame. So that
Yeah.
would be the goal, kind of back into it based on like the bedtime that you're shooting for.
Okay. I'm curious to know as the kids do get older, when do we start allowing them to have more independence? Like, when would you encourage that balance of us really being the ones leading that structure and then allowing them to take that time?
Oh yeah, I love that question. It's really dependent on the child. So I think the most important thing is their sleep.
Mhm.
So for kids who are, under 6 years old, we want them to be getting 10 to 12 hours of sleep a night. So
Okay.
do the math and kind of back into like what works best for you. And then I think as long as your kids, like my kids have always had a great bedtime routine. So we might have let things kind of be more child led because I knew that they could go to sleep independently. I was never concerned about that. Our evenings were peaceful. So If we, wanted to read an additional book or something, that it wasn't that big of a deal because I knew they already had those good sleep habits and we weren't
Mhm.
going to throw things totally out the window. But I would say some of this, I think, coincides with when kids start getting interested in reading on their own, because that becomes a nice, like, independent time. If you want kids to kind of read a book for a little bit by themselves, maybe while you put another child to bed, and then you come into their room and kind of finish the bedtime routine, that becomes a good time. So, maybe somewhere around first grade, stuff like that, giving kids some more independence.
So I'm curious, what prompted you to get into sleep consulting? Again, you are working specifically with younger kids, right?
3 to 8 years old is really
Okay.
like the age that I specialize in.
Okay. So what prompted you to get into this line of work?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you may guess, just my own personal my own personal story really led me to figure this out. So, my kids are 13 and 11 now, but back when my youngest was 3, we moved her to a bed. We moved her from the crib to a bed, and she'd always been a good sleeper in the crib. And then when we moved her to a bed, like, things just went crazy. Like, she was like a different kid. All of a sudden, she wouldn't stay put. Like, she didn't want to even sit in my lap to read books for bedtime. She started waking up in the middle of the night. She was trying to come into our bed, which we had never done that before. I'm like, what is happening? And it was miserable. I realized how much I needed my sleep when all of a sudden, I had a few months of just like sheer chaos going on in my house. So I took the rather drastic step of getting certified as a pediatric sleep coach, really for mainly the selfish purpose of figuring out how to solve my own problems, because nobody was talking about bigger kids, right? It only ever, if you talked about sleep coaches, it was all babies. So I really had to figure this out on my own. So that's how I started the business. And that's how I came up with the rest method that I use to help families of older kids.
So I want to just give you they're not rapid fire. You can take as long as you want to answer them, but just a few questions that are coming to mind that I think listeners would want to know. So, in what ways are we, I guess, hindering our kids? Like we're making bedtime worse for them. In what ways are we hindering them there at bedtime?
So I think this happens, parents do this in a very like unconscious, well meaning way. So, meaning our kids, if we always read one book, but our kid is really kind of being persistent and wants two books or whatever, we kind of give into that thinking like, okay, this will make him happy, and then I'll get him to bed. But it really just kind of invites them to keep asking for more and more things to see what they can kind of get away with. So I really do recommend, and it's not to be cold hearted, it's just to be efficient and to focus on that, the healthy sleep that our kids need is to really kind of keep that bedtime very well structured. Another thing I think we do as parents that kind of hinder our kids' abilities to sleep well is a lot of times these kids in this age range will really rope parents in to like laying with me while I fall asleep or holding hands, rub my back, that kind of thing. And what happens is, again, well-meaning, because we know our kids need to sleep, and so we do whatever we can to help them get sleep, but it really degrades our kids' ability to fall asleep independently. And what happens over the course of time in those situations is kids start to wake up and need to go find mom or dad again in the middle of the night. And then it's really kind of a slippery slope to kind of more sleep problems.
My next question has to do with waking up in the middle of the night with a bad dream, nightmares. How do we handle these moments?
Yeah. So I get asked this question a lot. And so I think the first thing to consider is it really a nightmare? And I think a lot of this comes down to parental intuition. Certainly at this age, 3, 4, 5 year olds, it's nightmares happen. But I will say, nightmares happen once in a while. Okay, nightmares are it's really unlikely they're going to happen every night, and certainly not multiple times a night. So lots of times I'll hear parents say, my kid, wakes up every 2 hours with a nightmare. Well, in that situation, I think we're really dealing with more of a sleep independence issue than we are actually like a scary dream. So that's the first thing to say about nightmares. But if a kid occasionally wakes up and they have had a bad dream, the best thing to do as a parent is calm them down. Certainly, give them a hug, rub their back, whatever you need to do to kind of get them calm.
Mhm.
I would say reassure them gently that they're safe, everything's okay. Don't encourage talking too much about what happened because you kind of want to get them past it rather than reliving it in the moment.
Mhm.
And then getting them back into their own room, right? Don't use this as a way to start a bad sleep habit that you don't want to continue. Like if you're bringing them into your bed, then all of a sudden you may see the instances of these nightmares increase so that they can come back and get in your bed.
Yeah, absolutely. My next question, somewhat along the same lines of the child wanting the parent there with them. I know a friend of mine, her daughter was really struggling. And I mean, I think this was like at 7 or 8, but her daughter was struggling with needing daddy to be there for her to fall asleep. So how do we slowly wean ourselves from doing that? And or do you believe we should just cut it off cold turkey?
Well, so that totally depends on the family. So it depends on the family and really their kind of parenting style and what feels the best for them. So you could definitely do it gradually. Depending on the child's age, too, there may be some other incentives. Like you're mentioning, like a 7 or 8 year old. Well, there could be potentially summer camps that your kid might want to attend or like a spend the night party. And so you could use those things almost as a carrot to help encourage your child. So yeah, there's many different methods that you can use, but it really depends on your parenting style. And the most important thing with kids that are older, whether they're 3 or 8 years old, is communicating with your child about whatever changes you plan to make. Because it's not like when they're 6 months old and you can just like do something to them, you know? It's not a decision that you can make for them. It's really it most effective and it's easiest if it's a collaborative process.
Okay. I'm curious on the flip side of bedtime. I have some friends that their kids wake up at the crack of dawn. Is there any way that we can get these kids to sleep longer?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I would say this is in the top 3 common issues that people come to me with. Certainly kids who are waking up super early, it's usually a problem with their sleep schedule. So we want kids sleeping naturally until at least 6 o'clock in the morning. So that's like a biologically appropriate wake up time for toddlers and preschoolers. So anytime after 6 is like the goal. So if you've got a kid who's waking up at 5 or 4:30, that is way too early. They're not getting enough sleep. So usually it's not too difficult to fix. The solve is actually putting them to bed earlier, which may seem counterintuitive. I know a lot of people are like, oh, no, no, if I put them to bed earlier, they're going to wake up even earlier. But what do we say? We say it's not logical, it's biological. So it's it really has to do with the amount of sleep that your kid needs. And kids who are waking up too early are typically going to bed too late. And chronically over time, that actually causes early wake ups. So just we want to focus again on that 10 to 12 hours of sleep. If your kid, I hear from a lot of families who say, oh, my kid only needs 9 hours of sleep, it's not enough. That's probably the source of most of the problems is just not enough sleep.
Okay, okay. I have two more questions for you. We are coming out of daylight savings time. Daylight savings time happened on Sunday. And I'm just wondering what strategies you have to make this easier, either the daylight savings or even like falling back in the fall.
Yeah, the time change sucks,
Hmm.
and that is that's just something we all feel as humans, I think, but especially as parents. The spring is easier typically for everybody to deal with because we lose an hour. The fall is a little bit more difficult because we gain an hour, and most kids aren't getting enough sleep anyway. And then you add in a whole extra hour in the day that causes a lot of chaos. So now, as we're coming into the spring and summer, the main challenge that we're dealing with is the sun, right? So the sun is going to be, it's already, it's light outside when kids should be going to bed. And it's going to start to be light in the morning too. So at this time of year, the best thing are those blackout curtains that will really help them to fall asleep because with our circadian rhythms, it really does need to be dark in order to fall asleep. So I think that's the best thing parents can do this time of year.
I've personally enjoyed it because I'm waking up slightly earlier and getting to read my books and drink my coffee because my kids are sleeping till 8 where they would have slept till 7.
That's great. Well, and some people like to keep that schedule, that little bit of a later schedule. So it depends if your kids are good sleepers, sometimes that actually does work out. But sometimes with a lot of families, kids will their schedule will ultimately adjust. It may take them a week or so, but ultimately they'll kind of go back to their normal sleep schedule.
Okay. And then my last question for you is just what is one way that we can improve our children's sleep or help them improve their sleep tonight, today?
The easiest thing that we can all do tonight, if your kid is having trouble sleeping, is put them to bed a little bit earlier. 15 minutes earlier is all it takes.
Okay, okay. Well, is there any other word of advice you'd like to leave with the listeners before we wrap up?
Yeah, there was one other thing I was gonna tell you. This is like a big hit with my audience
Okay.
because a lot of times I hear from families who say that their child has some separation anxiety at bedtime. And the first thing I like to do is like reframe that just a little bit. I feel like when we say separation anxiety, it sounds somewhat medical, almost like it's something that we can't overcome as parents, that it's like a problem that's not solvable. So I like to say trouble with separating at bedtime because that sounds like a little bit more positive. And so what I teach this craft to people in my sleep course, and it's using the bedtime book called The Invisible String by Patrice Karst. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I haven't. I'm Googling it right now.
Oh, I love this book. So it's about how we are all connected by an invisible string of love. So like it starts out with like we're connected to, our siblings and our parents. So even if you're in the living room and I'm in my bedroom, we're still connected. And it goes on to, you're connected to your pets and you're connected to your family that lives in another state. And, the whole universe is ultimately connected by like an invisible string of love. So it's like a beautiful story, but it also it starts with the kids have a nightmare and they run out to be with their mom. And so the mom explains how we're all attached by this invisible string, even when we're not
Okay.
together. And so I love that as a bedtime book. And then you can even, like with your kids, cut out like a little heart out of construction paper and maybe have your kid, like, design it. Maybe you design, like, draw on one for them and they make one for you. And then you just tape it on the wall by your bed and you can always touch it. And, that's like directly connected to the heart that's by mom's bed.
That's really sweet. I love that idea. That's a great takeaway too, is to just implement tonight. I think people probably have time to cut out a little heart if they're listening in the morning. So I think that's a great last word of advice. Well, Jessica, where can listeners find you and connect with you online if they want to do so?
Yeah. So my business is Awesome Little Sleepers, and I'm on Instagram mostly, same name, Awesome Little Sleepers. And I've got a free toddler sleep masterclass if people want to kind of learn more if they're struggling with any sleep issues. And it's a free class, but you have to save a spot. And they can do that at toddlersleepmasterclass.com.
Perfect. Well, as we wrap things up here, I'm going to ask you two questions that I ask every guest. And the first one is, what has been a beneficial resource in your life that you want to share with the listeners? And this can be in relation to sleep or just something that has been helpful to you as a mom.
Gosh, let me think. Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I think one great resource is a book that I'm obsessed with. It's called You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero. And it's just a great way to view your life and your thoughts about your own life. So I'm obsessed with that book.
Okay, I haven't read that one. I'll have to include it in the show notes and do a little Google on that one as well. All right. And then my last question for you is, what is something that you can't stop talking about?
Okay, I've got two things. One I'd say is spring because I live in Connecticut and all of a sudden, like 2 days ago, I started noticing little buds in all the trees. And so now I'm slightly obsessed with I'm like, yes, it's happening. It's happening. Winter is over. And the superficial one is lesser evil popcorn. Oh my God.
Oh, yes.
Totally obsessed.
So good. It is really good popcorn. I love the Himalayan salt version of that.
Yes.
So good.
Delicious.
Yes. Well, Jessica, thanks so much for joining me today and sharing all your wisdom here in this area. I feel like we covered a lot of ground. So hopefully this was helpful to people.
Yeah, we did. We covered a lot. So thank you so much for having me.